Good afternoon and welcome to the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus webinar focusing on Great Lakes legislation in federal, state, and provincial capitals. Today's webinar is the second installment of the caucus's Great Lakes Great Webinars series in 2015. Here is the agenda for the hour. Now I'll turn the floor over to the chair of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, Wisconsin Representative Corey Mason.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to be focusing this afternoon on Great Lakes-related legislation that has been introduced at the federal level, as well as in our states and provinces. This legislative update has become an annual spring event for the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus, and it's a great opportunity for legislators to learn about developments throughout the region and in Washington, D.C. I'm pleased today to introduce our speaker, Ms. Danielle Chesky, Director of the Northeast Midwest Institute's Great Lakes Washington program. On past webinars, Danielle has done an excellent job briefing caucus members on federal legislation, and we're glad to welcome her back. As part of her work, Danielle assists the bipartisan Great Lakes Task Force within the U.S. Congress. Prior to joining the Northeast Midwest Institute, Danielle served as the Legislative and Fishery Management Plan Coordinator for the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, where she coordinated interstate fisheries management plans for 9 species groups along the Atlantic coast. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Denison University and 2 Master's of Science degrees in Marine Biology and Marine Policy from the University of Maine. Danielle is a native of the Great Lakes region, having been born in Cleveland, Ohio, and having grown up in Saginaw, Michigan, where she first learned to fish. After Danielle is done with her presentation, we'll have time for some questions, and then we'll go around the region to hear about legislation in the Great Lakes states and provinces. I've asked the members of the caucus's executive committee to provide a roundup of the legislation in their jurisdictions, and so we'll start with those members who are on the line, time permitting, and if there is interest, we will open up the lines for other legislators to say a few words about legislation that you may have introduced. Danielle, thank you very much for participating in our webinar today. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Representative Mason. So happy to be speaking with you all again. As mentioned, my name is Danielle Chesky. I work with the Great Lakes Task Force here in D.C. I guess one quick update on there. We had quite a few retirements from the Great Lakes congressional delegation during the past Congress. We estimated about 180 years worth of seniority left the Great Lakes congressional federal delegation. A lot of that, as I'm sure you can expect, was tied up between Congressman Dingell and Senator Levin. That also opened up some opportunities for leadership positions with the Great Lakes Task Forces. We were very happy that Congresswoman Kaptur joined the House co-chairs. Those include as well Congresswoman Miller from Michigan, Congressman Duffy from Wisconsin, and Congresswoman Slaughter from New York. On the Senate side, Senator Stabenow took over for Senator Levin's position on the Senate Great Lakes Task Force, and Ms. Klobuchar from Minnesota took over for that vice chair position. So some opportunities for some new leadership to continue forward. We're going to talk today, as mentioned, about the 2015 legislative outlook. A list here of some bills that actually have to do with policy and authorization rather than just spending. But due to the year and what we're looking at, as I'm sure you've heard in the media, there's going to be still quite a bit of focus on the appropriations process. So we will get right into it. This year, the Great Lakes Ecological and Economic Protection Act, as well as the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative bills, were reintroduced on the House and the Senate side. On the Senate side, it was introduced by Senators Baldwin, Senator Stabenow, and Senator Kirk. It's sort of the full, what we call the GLLC bill. It authorizes not only the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is currently just an Obama administration budget initiative, but as well as the National Program Office, the EPA, the Great Lakes Legacy Act, which focuses on cleanup of the areas of concern, the Interagency Task Force, which was created by Bush II executive order in 2004, and the Great Lakes Advisory Board. In contrast to last year, the funding authorization total for the bill is a little bit down. It was at $650 last year and is down to $475. That keeps it more in line to where we saw funding for the GLRI program in its first year back in 2010. On the House side, the bill was reintroduced by Congressman Joyce, Congressman Levin, and Congresswoman Slaughter. This is similar to the bill that actually passed the House last year, late in session. It authorizes just the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative at $300 million for funding. Both bills authorize the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative through 2020. As mentioned, a version of this bill passed the House last year. It got stalled in the Senate, however, which is why we don't have a Great Lakes Restoration law. We still just have a bill. Moving forward, invasive species have also taken quite a bit of a spotlight early on in this Congress. The first one that I'll discuss is called the Defending Our Great Lakes Act. It was introduced in both the House and the Senate by Congresswoman Miller and Senator Stabenow. It focuses on the Brandon Road Lock and Dam area and one-way prevention of invasive species moving from the Mississippi River to the Great Lakes. A lot of focus of this bill is Asian carp, which folks have heard quite a bit about. There has been a lot of work to sort of look at this bill and modify the language from what we saw introduced at the end of last Congress by Congressman Camp and Senator Stabenow. One thing to note about this bill, which I'm sure you're all aware, it is a bipartisan bill, but it's a regionally divided issue. As of right now, there aren't any Indiana or Illinois co-sponsors of the bill. The co-sponsors were very focused on getting language out so there can be a continued discussion over the coming 1 to 2 years as Congress moves through. The other major invasive species bill that's garnered a lot of attention is called the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. Again, you're seeing the theme. This was introduced last year as well, moved through committee on the Senate side. What this does is focuses on the ballast discharge piece. Currently we have regulations and authority to regulate ballast water discharge both under the Coast Guard and under the Environmental Protection Agency through the Clean Water Act. And what this bill would do is put forth one national standard consistent with the current standard, but the authority for that would be taken out or away from the Clean Water Act and given just to the Coast Guard with EPA in a consultation role. There's a couple of major issues that folks have identified with this bill, one being the environmental concerns about what would be required or not required in testing and so forth. The other thing has been brought up as sort of a states' rights issue. Under the Clean Water Act, the states have the ability to put forth 404 requirements for permits for discharge. Under this bill, they would no longer have that authority. For some states who've not invested very much in the ballast discharge issue, for them it's probably not such a big deal. There have been quite a few states though within the Great Lakes as well as the West Coast who have and have raised concerns with it. This bill has moved through the Commerce Committee on the Senate side. Senator Peters from Michigan serves as the ranking member for the subcommittee with jurisdiction. He was able to include a couple of amendments before it moved through, but I think there was certainly recognition that there would need to be further modifications before this bill could pass. Algal blooms and nutrients have taken on a renewed focus ever since the Toledo Do Not Drink Advisory back in August of 2014. On the House side, the bill, the Drinking Water Protection Act, H.R. 212, sponsored by Congressman Matta from Ohio, passed the House. It requires a strategic plan from the EPA within 90 days, many of folks imagine that as part of the strategic plan would be recommendations on monitoring, detection, and treatment of cyanotoxins and algal toxins for wastewater treatment plants. It also requires information coordination, which has been a large identified issue, as well as a report to Congress within 90 days. There is a similar bill that's a bit more focused just on those recommendations for monitoring, detection, and treatment that's been introduced on the Senate side by Senators Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown from Ohio. But as of right now, there's not been any movement there. Just as also an FYI, there's been a lot of focus and attention on nutrient trading within Congress. The Northeast Midwest Institute will be hosting a briefing on trading at the end of April. We're not sure yet whether or not we'll have webinar access for that, but if we do, we'll be sure to push that out to folks moving forward. Also, we expect NOAA to provide an integrated assessment strategic plan this summer and fall as required under the harmful algal bloom reauthorization bill that was passed last Congress, and that was sponsored by Senator Portman from Ohio. Finally, this year we do expect to see some sort of surface transportation bill. The short-term patches will expire or expired in September 2014. We have a patch through the end of May. Likely we'll see some other patches unfortunately put in. There's a lot of things that can be included in this that will be very important for the region, including shoring up the Highway Trust Fund, public-private partnerships, and potentially something to do with invasive species or Asian carp, as this precedent was set back with MAP 21 that passed in 2012. Possibilities of including in this could include some sort of adjustment to the gas tax, charge for mileage, or devolution of the program to states. All of those come with their positive and negative aspects, but I definitely think we'll see a short-term patch before we see any sort of long-term bill. So have to sort of stay tuned. Finally, appropriations. This is the one thing that we're fairly certain will always continue to move. Nobody wants to shut down the government like happened last time. That was a big black eye really on everybody here in DC. So for fiscal year 15, we're done. They passed the omnibus. I have a silly looking face there because it's sort of a positive and negative depending upon which program you're paying attention to. There was level funding for the GLLC program at $300 million, as well as for the state revolving funds, both important to the region. The LIHEAP and the community development block grants saw a slight decrease, but not as much as was originally proposed by the president's budget request last year. Additionally, there was a lot of good signs in there coming from the Army Corps to support operations and maintenance work within the region. There's quite a bit more additional dredging and maintenance funding, as well as almost doubling the amount of funding for construction of the final electrical barrier in the Chicago area waterway system. So hopefully the expectation is that with the 15-year funding and whatever potentially comes out of 16, that construction will be finalized. To 16, the President's budget came out on time, which the Appropriations Committee, everyone here in DC was very happy about. You see there's some of the funding levels that were provided for the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund for operation maintenance of our navigable waterways and harbors. The GLRI came in at its lowest, either appropriated or requested level at $250 million. This received quite a bit of congressional attention, as I'm sure you can guess, and letters have been circulating regarding appropriations levels and are being set in this week. The letter on the House side requested $300 million from appropriators. There's quite a bit of large focus there. The Northeast and North Institute puts together sort of a full list of programs that have been historically relevant to the region, and that's on our website. It also includes sort of a large report of the impact of the budget requests on the region. The other fun part, the fiscal year 16 will be discussion on budget and sequestration. The House and Senate have passed their own budget resolutions, and I firmly expect that over the next 2-week recess we will be seeing sort of the negotiations happen to come to a compromise between those. The other big sort of elephant in the room is the sequestration, which will come back for fiscal year 16 unless there is something else done. There's a lot of discussion there about funding levels for the discretionary programs, which are all the ones we're talking about, and how much should be cut from defense versus other discretionary. So that's sort of a TBD, and we'll be reporting on that as we hear more. So looking forward to what's next. As I mentioned, there's been a bunch of approach letters circulating around. So we'll be posting those in our Hill Happenings and our weekly update, which will come out next week. Budget hearings are ongoing, but the big point coming out of the budget resolution will be sort of what's the top line number that the committee should be planning for. And that will impact a lot, I think, in terms of what we see for EPA or Fish and Wildlife Service or the Army Corps. The bills are being actively worked on, so we'll be expect to see a lot of those starting to come out after the recess. As mentioned, there's quite a few bills in the works, invasive species, algal blooms and nutrients, and the GLRI. The $300 million is what we've seen will pass, so we'll see what happens in terms of that. A lot of folks are waiting for the Government Accountability Office's report to come out. Right now it's expected in June. I put that in and take that date with a grain of salt. The report was supposed to come out in September 2014, so we'll see when that happens. And then surface transportation is always an opportunity, but there are larger issues there that need to be dealt with. One last thing I'll mention is that we will be having a briefing on invasive species on Thursday, April 16th. There will be webinar access. I'll be sure to forward that information along to Tim and Lisa so that can be distributed if anybody wants to tune in. And with that, I'll open it up to questions or what best fits the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. We have a few minutes for questions. And if you have questions, please remember to type your question or click on the hand icon to raise your hand. Danielle, I had a question just to kick it off, if that's okay. The discharge bill that came up last time, which appears to be back again, we actually did sort of a dear colleague letter to members of Congress raising our concerns, particularly around the ability of states to still have a hand in there, and a concern that the federal standard that is being set would be insufficient. You sort of went through where the bill is in the process, but what's the prognosis of improving the bill or stopping the bill if it doesn't at least have a sufficient standard or allow states to have a sufficient standard on invasives and ballast water?
It's a good question. You know, and to be honest, so in the committee it got through, but 5 individuals wanted to be voted as no against this bill, and these include Senator Blumenthal, Senator Markey, Senator Cantwell, and I'm going to blank on the other 2. But I think in terms of the prognosis, the bill will not move without any, if it does not get any additional modifications. There's very strong advocates who are against what this is currently looking like. Senator Boxer and Senator Cantwell have been very vocal about it. They were very vocal about it last year as well. I don't know what the solution is, so if any of you have an idea of how to make this work with some sort of a change, I know the committee's goal is to get to a national standard, and we're not totally, you know, we've been asked at the Institute, because we've been very involved in the ballast testing process, sort of what the solution to keep the states' rights there. You know, as you mentioned, the permitting and the input on the standard and stuff like that. And we haven't come up with a solution yet that seems to work for both sides. So I'll open it up. You know, if anybody has an idea, please email us. But until there are modifications, we don't see this moving. This would have to move by unanimous consent in the Senate, and it's not going to. There will be objections. From the House perspective, we've talked to committee staff over there, and I think they're tired of leading on the issue, so they're going to wait to see what the Senate does first. So really, you know, that's good news, because then that means all the focus is in terms of providing input and feedback in the Senate, but it will need work before it moves.
Okay, great. Danielle, or I'm sorry, Lisa, I'm going to hand it over to you to call on people for questions then.
Sure, and it looks like Senator Boer from Michigan has his hand raised. Senator Boer, I'm opening up your line.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you, Director, for that information, and it's very informative. To Senate Bill 504 and House Bill 223, when I see $475 million to 2020 or $300 million to 2020, does that mean to me $475 million over that period of time, or does that mean $475 million is what we're trying to get for per year through 2020?
Right. So the numbers that you see there would be authorized per year through 2020. Clearly, then it's still up to the appropriators to say how much up to that amount can be allocated towards that program, but it would be per year. So 475 per year or 300 per year. And you know, as I'm sure you all know, the GLLC bill has been right around that $300 million mark for the past 5 years, I think now. So that's pretty consistent where we've seen the appropriations level.
And you would expect then most likely $300 million? Again?
That's what passed. Yeah, for the funding, yes, I expect. You know, there's been a lot of good bipartisan support to expect for fiscal year 16. Really hoping and expecting that we'll see a $300 million level for funding. In terms of that authorization bill, the bill that had $300 million was the one that passed the House last year, and now with both chambers controlled by the same party, it would make sense that a bill that passed last year in the House would be the one that folks would be looking to pass this year next. But I don't think we'll see any movement on that until we get that GAO bill or GAO report.
And that's expected when?
Right now, June-ish. So.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll go with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a written question from Speaker Dave Levac. And the question is, are you working in concert with provincial and Canadian authorities to coordinate the spending and actions?
No, this is U.S. money, and so it has to be spent on the U.S. side. There is some coordination ongoing with the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, whereby the Canadian and U.S. partners are working on making sure that their efforts are coordinated. But in terms of specific coordination with that, not specifically.
Okay, great. And Danielle, do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Senator Ann Rest from Minnesota has her hand raised. Senator Rest?
Good afternoon. I was wondering how the funding for the GLRI compares with funding for other great water areas that have had attention focused on them in the past, like the Chesapeake Bay or the Everglades or the Northwest region of the United States. Are we keeping up with the funding with GLRI relative to whatever ongoing funding is being directed to those other areas?
I actually think we're catching quite a bit of negative attention because we are receiving so much funding. To be honest. There's been some discussion from the folks in the San Francisco Bay Area and the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay has consistently gotten quite a bit of funding, about $70 million per year. But the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding is now up to about $1.9 billion. So we are, I think, more than keeping pace.
Wonderful.
Okay, our next question.
Other questions?
Yeah, we actually have one from Kyle Rora. And the question is, where can more information be found on the nutrient trading concept?
Well, there's a couple of different groups that are working on it. The Great Lakes Commission has been working on a project in the Fox River. I can put together some more information as well and send along if you'd like. I think that'd probably be the easiest.
All right. Thank you again, Danielle. That was a great presentation. Now we'll have a virtual round table to hear briefly 5-minute reports from our members on the Executive Committee about legislation and related developments in your respective states and provinces. If anyone has questions as we go along, remember to raise your hand and Lisa will unmute you and your line to speak. Or if you're listening in but aren't viewing the presentation, you can email your question to gllc@csg.org and Lisa will read it on the air. We'll start with the western edge of our region with Minnesota. Giving the report will be Senator Ann Rest, who is the immediate past chair of the caucus. Senator Rest?
Thank you, Corey. Well, I want to raise just 4 things that are going on in Minnesota. One of them is, the first one is a county aid program that we have instituted, $10 million for the counties to deal with aquatic invasive species. And as you know, Minnesota has many, many lakes, and we are always concerned about the relationship, the healthy relationship between those lakes and Lake Superior. The 2015 appropriation takes almost 1/10 of that amount, almost $1 million for counties that are bordering Lake Superior. So we're looking forward to some really positive results with that ongoing annual appropriation. We have had some pushback, on the other hand, with our decal program for for boats and trailers that requires a brief training to educate boaters about cleaning their boats and making sure that they're not taking critters from one lake to another. But we finally, I think, have reached some compromise that we will amend the program rather than end it, as some would have. Our most positive thing has been the proposals dealing with plastic microbeads. Several bills have been proposed this year to prohibit them from being used in personal care products by 2017, as well as over-the-counter drugs by 2018, and I'm happy to be a co-author on all of them. We are also pleased that Senator Marty's bill, Senate File 674, which deals with the microplastics, is moving forward, and it has reached both the House and the Senate floor. So we're expecting ultimately a positive outcome there. Also, Governor Dayton has requested legislation that will require at least 50 feet of vegetation buffers around the state's waterways, and with the hope that those buffers would help protect waterways from erosion and runoff pollution, which we also are concerned, again, because we have so many lakes and waterways, that that kind of pollution and runoff would affect eventually Lake Superior. Unfortunately, although the bill was passed in the Senate Environment and Energy Committee, it failed to meet the deadlines in either the House or the Senate, but it is a concern in terms of our clean water standards that we continue to deal with, and has raised that issue to a lot of public comment and conversation. So I'm sure that issue is going to be returning to the legislature, particularly because of the governor's advocacy.
Thank you, Senator Rest. Next we'll hear from Ontario Speaker Dave Levac. Speaker Levac?
Am I being heard?
You are.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. And a very large thank you to all the people that are working so hard to protect probably around 1/3 of the clean water on the entire planet. So I deeply appreciate and take this very seriously. Just to give you an update, I have about a 7- or 8-page report that I would make available for the entire group and have it submitted, but I don't want to go through the whole report. So I'll highlight some of the issues that Ontario is dealing with. Ontario's Great Lakes strategy was established in 2012. And the initial idea is to simply say that the Great Lakes waters remain usable for drinking, swimming, fishing, recreation. The current implementation actions that focus on different ideas would be including concentrating on climate change adaptation, First Nations issues that are respectful of First Nations communities and their treaty rights, community engagement, development of effective agricultural best management practices in a positive way, biodiversity protection and combative of invasive species, as we've all heard what's going on the United States side. Great Lakes Protection Act, an actual piece of legislation that was passed, introduced, called Bill 66, which basically talks about the ecological health of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin. And also the act itself would give the government more tools to address some of the stresses that the lakes are faced with. Allowing the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change to set targets. Those are the kinds of issues that particular piece. We also have the Invasive Species Act to deal with, as the Senator Ann said before. And Microbead Elimination Monitoring Act is a private member's bill, but the government is actually looking at that to deal with microbeads in the Great Lakes Basin completely. Initiatives and agreements that Ontario is involved in is the Canada-U.S. Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, the Ontario-Canada Agreement on Great Lakes water quality and ecosystem health, implementing the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Water Basin Sustainable Water Resources Agreement. That includes several provinces and the country itself with cooperation with the United States. Studies on water quality and levels from the Ministry of Natural Resources are continuing. And other developments that I think this one's important to note that this is a North American issue. The Ontario Power Generation's proposal for nuclear waste plants, at one time their proposal is to bury more than 600 meters deep into limestone storage within 1.2 kilometers, that's less than a mile, towards Lake Huron. Federally appointed panel has delayed the decision, and it seems to be prompted by the accident that did take place underground in New Mexico. So we're not expecting any of this to be finished by the decision of the panel by the end of 2015. And we also note that the state of Michigan unanimously passed legislations and resolutions to reconsider, cancel the Bruce Nuclear Waste Facility program of burying. It also asked the President and the Secretary of State and the Congress to ask for an international joint commission to evaluate any proposed facility of this kind around our Great Lakes. So I think that there's some really good work going on, and the question I asked earlier was to see if there was ways we can coordinate, not necessarily to share spending, but to at least coordinate where we're spending our money so that we get the best bang for our buck. Having said that, I will make the report available, and I thank all of you for the work that you're doing on the great fresh water we have between our two nations.
Thank you, Speaker Levac. We'll move on to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with Representative Kurt Sonny giving the report. Representative Sonny?
He may be having difficulty joining us.
Okay. Well, with that, then we'll move on to the eastern edge of the region. Representing Quebec on the Executive Committee is MNA Guy Ouellette. Mr. Ouellette?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Everybody is hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm happy to be here to outline the main legislative and political development that occur in the area since our last meeting in July of 2014 in Quebec City. One of our main issue in the area here concerned TransCanada offshore drilling and construction of an oil port in Cacouna on the St. Lawrence River. Exploratory drilling began in August 2014 but was suspended 1 month later following a Quebec Superior Court decision which raised concern about the impact of the offshore drilling on the reproduction of beluga whales and endangered species. In response, the Quebec Department of Sustainable Development, the Environment and the Fight Against Climate Change announced that TransCanada may not resume seismic testing of Cacouna unless it submits a proposal that it's acceptable to the department. This proposal must meet a number of conditions that include ensuring social acceptability, producing an environmental assessment, and providing an emergency response measures plan. Taking economic and environmental responsibility in the event of an oil leak or spill, and demonstrating that the project will generate economic and fiscal spin-off for all Quebec. So TransCanada is currently assessing the situation, and they have until next Tuesday, so March 21st, to announce its intention regarding this oil port project. Because TransCanada project want to build an oil pipeline crossing the St. Lawrence Valley and the Témiscouata region to link Alberta and New Brunswick, also raise a lot of concern among Quebecers. Because of the risk of leak or spill and their adverse effect on drinking water source in many Quebec regions must be assessed too. The environmental impact study of the project as a whole will be carried out shortly by the BAP, Quebec Environmental Public Hearing Office. Another important development concerned the water withdrawal and protection regulation that came into force in August 2014 and was announced, if you remember, by our minister when he lectured in our last meeting. It came in force in August with the exception of a few sections. The regulation implements a new regime for authorized water withdrawal to better protect drinking water source. It's also provide a framework for activities related to oil and gas exploration and production. In the future, there will be protection zone for surface water withdrawal, and municipality will have to analyze the vulnerability of their drinking water supply sources to determine each source potential risk and establish adapt protection measures. There's also some project underway. We will review the Environment Quality Act. In February of 2015, the government announced that the environmental authorization process in effect since 1972 would be modernized. The goal of modernization effort was to integrate fight against climate change in the authorization process, to target projects with major environmental impact, or to simplify the process for low-impact projects while maintaining environmental requirements, and also to increase department efficiency. Finally, the government is currently developing a maritime strategy to highlight Quebec maritime potential in the context of growing international trade. It was announced in yesterday's budget, and there will be $1.5 billion will dedicate it to that maritime strategy till 2020. To conclude, on Monday this week, Quebec Premier Philippe Couillard met with Vermont Governor Peter Shumlin. They signed a partnership renewing their cooperation that started 27 years ago in regard to water quality, protection against invasive species, and other environmental management issues, especially in Lake Champlain. And I'd like to point out that Quebec City will host the next Leadership Summit of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Governor and Premier in June 2015. Numbers of issues that are relevant for our Legislative Caucus will be discussed at that time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Watt. That was great. And before we move on to Michigan, I would be remiss if I didn't thank you and the delegation from Quebec for doing such a great job hosting us last summer. I know the people who attended got a lot from the conference, but really loved your city. So thank you very much.
We appreciate it.
Yes. Moving to Michigan, we'll hear from the Vice Chair of the caucus, Senator Boer. Senator Boer, are you online?
Okay. Thank you very much. And from Michigan, we got two issues to bring forth today, and I want to thank the Speaker from Ontario, Dave Lebec. This leads right into our resolution that we were asking the caucus to consider, and I'll just kind of go through it, but it was a great lead-in for what I was going to say today. Michigan has adopted a resolution regarding the deep geological respiratory, or we call it the DGR project, being proposed by Ontario's power generation. The proposal is to construct an underground long-term burial facility for the low and intermediate level radioactive waste at a site that is less than a mile inland from the shores of Lake Huron. We have questions about how this could impact the Great Lakes should there be a leak or other problem. The Great Lakes are a shared resource between the U.S. and Canada as recognized under the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. The treaty created an international joint commission, the IJC, that consists of 3 members from the U.S. and 3 members from Canada to act as an impartial watchdog over the boundary waters between the countries. The IJC has been asked to weigh in on major topics of concern over the years, so Michigan has adopted a resolution to urge the IJC to review the proposed storage site. I would like the Great Lakes Caucus to do the same and have talked to the caucus staff about doing a sign-on letter encouraging the IJC to review the issue or possibly have a webinar on the DGR when the caucus talks about the energy issues soon. That is a suggestion that we'll have here today from Michigan. The second issue, there is a need to address the dredging and the infrastructure needs in the Great Lakes. There are 112 federal small harbors in the Great Lakes. These harbors are underfunded and poorly maintained. In fiscal year 15-16, federal budgets include dredging for 9 of the 41 commercial harbors, but none for our recreational harbors. The Corps identified 37 recreational and 20 commercial harbors as is need of dredging for 2015. The Great Lakes Small Harbors Coalition, created in Michigan in 2008, represents recreational and commercial harbors Great Lake wide. The coalition is asking for the harbor maintenance tax to be used for its intended purpose to maintain our federal harbors. The annual HMT revenue is $1.8 billion, while only half has been spent annually over the past 20 years to maintain the nation's federal harbors. There is a balance of about $10 billion that has not been spent for its intended purpose of maintaining our federal harbors. Last year, the coalition provided support for the passage of Congress of the 2014 Water Resources Reform and Development Act, we call the WRRDA. WRRDA was supposed to address the problems with HMTF by gradually phasing in full appropriation of the tax receipts by FY25. But the FY15 appropriations and 16 budget requests fall short of that phased-in percentage. GLLC is asking that we all come together and to work to get this funding appropriated. I want to bring this issue forward to state lawmakers' attention in the caucus to see what we can make happen at the federal level. Those are the 2 issues that I wanted to bring forth for Michigan, and hope for support in the future on those items. Thank you. Representative Mason?
Thank you, Senator Boer. Finally, I'll report on developments here in Wisconsin. The good news, the best news that we have going on so far is our microbeads legislation, which is modeled after the Illinois legislation that passed in the last biennium. It has passed unanimously out of committee in both the Assembly and the Senate, and the Senate is scheduled to take it up this next month in April. So it is our hope that that will become law in Wisconsin before the end of the year. Moving on to our state budget, there's a number of issues within the budget that have people concerned as it relates to the Great Lakes. First and foremost, there's what's called our stewardship fund, which the state uses to set aside land and put it into a public trust. And we've certainly used that fund a great deal in the Great Lakes Basin, both in Michigan and Superior's basins, to set aside a great deal of land for recreation, for hunting, and to improve water quality and reduce runoff. Unfortunately, the bonding authority moving forward that has been entirely eliminated in this budget. Additionally, of concern are the federally funded positions in our Wisconsin DNR. These are over 20 positions that receive no state funding. They're entirely federally funded. They're all scientists who evaluate proposals in front of the DNR as it relates to the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and in the budget those positions are eliminated entirely. Additionally, along with what Senator Boer was saying, we have a small but not nearly appropriately well-funded enough fund that helps with our small harbors that has bonding authority. That bonding authority is reduced to zero and also eliminated for future projects. So we got a lot of stuff going on in the budget that have some real impact on the Great Lakes. Additionally, outside of the budget, there's discussion of Enbridge expanding a pipeline from Superior through the state of Wisconsin in terms of bringing Canadian tar sand oils down. There's been a bit of discussion about that in terms of what the potential impact could be to the Great Lakes. And there's ongoing discussion about ballast water in relation to should we do something at the state level, and real concerns about that federal legislation that we heard about earlier. And then there was also a great deal of discussion several years ago in Wisconsin where we repealed a good deal of our wetlands and clean water standards to allow for the largest open pit mine in the country to go in very close to Lake Superior, and that passed. But the company announced that they would not be able to overcome the requirements that still existed under federal law to be able to do the mine that they wanted. So that's been put on hold, much to the relief of people in Lake Superior or near Lake Superior who were worried about adverse effects of runoff from an iron ore mine going into Lake Superior. And then just as a couple of things I will mention, aside from legislation, that I thought was really positive. If you haven't had one of these in your state, I would encourage you to do so. We had CSG do a presentation to legislators in our state about the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. We had picked a day that we hoped that both houses would be able to attend. Unfortunately, it wound up being a day that we were in special session and the Senate was debating right-to-work legislation, so nobody from the Senate came. But much to my delight and surprise, the Assembly, which has 99 members, had 26 members show up, and I think we got several new members join the caucus as a result of the presentation. And then just in response to some of these colleague letters that we've been doing around the state, whether it's on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding that we heard about earlier, we still have a little bit of time. If people haven't signed on to that bill, I would encourage you to do so, or also encourage members of the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus in your state, if they haven't signed on, to please do so. And based on what I've heard from Senator Boer and what I heard earlier in the presentation from Danielle, it seems like we may need to do some dear colleague letters on both the ballast water discharge issue and the issue of nuclear waste near Lake Huron. So I anticipate we'll be learning about those topics again, and maybe having letters to go along with it shortly. And with that, I will move on to announcements. I want to thank everyone again, and thank you to the Executive Committee members for your contributions and your updates to today's webinar. The Great Lakes Legislative Caucus staff maintains 2 legislative trackers, one for state and provincial legislation and the other for federal legislation. And the newly updated trackers are available on the GLLC website. So I would encourage you to send information on new bills happening in your state to Tim Anderson of the CSG Midwest staff, and to use that website as a resource. We'll be scheduling additional installments of our webinar series starting in April with a webinar focusing on transportation. In May, we plan to address the topic of aquatic invasive species. Watch for registration information on these webinars to come out at the beginning of each month. And finally, on May 1st, early bird registration will open for caucus members who wish to attend the 2015 annual meeting in Buffalo, New York. The meeting will take place on September 25th and 26th at the Embassy Suites. General registration will open June 1st. Watch for registration information to come via email. And then with that, I will turn it back over to Lisa. Lisa?
Thank you, Representative Mason, and thank you to all our participants today. Remember that you can view any of these webinars at any time by visiting the GLLC website or CSG Midwest's YouTube channel at the addresses you see on the screen. I'll also put these links in the email messages that you'll receive in follow-up to the webinar. The caucus is on Twitter at GLL Caucus, so I hope those of you who use Twitter will follow the caucus and share tweets about Great Lakes issues that affect your jurisdictions. And finally, please take a minute to fill out the short survey that will pop up as soon as we're done here. Your feedback really does help us to improve these webinars. I hope you'll join us again and that you'll let your colleagues know about this helpful resource for staying up to date on issues that affect the Great Lakes. This concludes our webinar. Have a great weekend, everyone.